Welcome, everyone, to our monthly workshop. And we are very excited to be able to present to you today a talk by Lena Lorenz. The title of it is Practices of Memory and Formation of Identity and Ethnographic Study in Orthodox Faith Communities. So let me tell you a little bit about Lena. Lena is currently a postdoctoral research fellow at the Georgetown Howard Center for Medical Humanities and Health Justice in Washington, D.C. With the desire to integrate theological, biomedical, and therapeutic perspectives and approaches, Lena first went to the University of Leipzig, where she gained a bachelor's and master's degree in special education and theology, and worked in different contexts of special education and psychiatry. In 2016, she attended our Spirituality, Theology, and Health Research workshop. At that time, it was in Gdansk, Poland, in Europe, and she started to pursue further study in this field. She has a Master's of Science in Spirituality, Theology, and Health, and a PhD in Theology and Health from Durham University in the UK. A revised version of her PhD thesis on hope in the context of chronic physical pain will be published later this year by Routledge. So I will turn it over to Lena, and she will share her screen and begin her presentation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Koenig. Okay, how's that looking?
Oh, it's looking good.
Excellent. So let me begin with how I came to the study on practices of memory, which I initially called rituals of remembrance, but the change of wording will become clear in a moment. Now, okay, I don't seem to be able to go to the next slide. Okay, I think I shared the wrong window. Apologies. Let's try this. Here we go. So my doctoral studies on hope in the context of chronic physical pain integrated Christian theology with an empirical study. In both the literature and the narrative interviews, it was evident that memory plays a key role in the building of hope. To anyone who knows the Jewish scriptures or Christian sacraments, this will not come as a surprise. Throughout the Hebrew Bible, God tells the people of Israel to remember who he is and what he has done so that they may have hope for the future. Christians throughout the millennia and across the world share week after week in a meal that was initiated by Jesus with the words, "Do this in remembrance of me." And they do so in the hope of the second coming of Christ and eternal salvation. What I repeatedly heard in the interviews then was that individuals of any faith or none may look back at past achievements of good things that have happened to them or others to gain hope for the present. And what we can observe more broadly is that a nation or local community may join in secular corporate practices of remembering victories or more often tragedies, for example, resulting from natural forces or human corruption. And they do so to mourn pain and losses and subsequently move on to imagining a better future and working together for the common good. We see that remembrance most obviously relates to time, but also to action, and it is deeply relational between persons and between human beings and God. Such remembrance, the intentional effort of looking back to the past with and for others, nourishes hope because hope in itself is embedded in time, action, and relationships. That hope is most evidently displayed in the Judeo-Christian story of redemption. It is a very different idea of hope than the one that is currently applied in health research, where hope is quantitatively measured as a cognitive behavioral coping strategy. I'm not saying that goal pursuit and motivation are not part of hope, but they're precisely that. They are a part of hope, namely the specific embodiment of an abstract hope. The concepts of Snyder and others thus do have their place, but they're narrowing the idea of hope down to one small aspect of a much wider and deeper phenomenon. It is therefore the broader hope of Christian theology that I have in mind when I ask the question of what practicing remembrance looks like and how it embodies and communicates the narrative of hope. Let me turn to the context of the study and briefly talk about places, people, and practices of remembering here in Washington, D.C. First, the culture of Washington, D.C. Memory here is a public matter, and the National Mall places commemoration at the very center of the city. Here, a relatively recent development is worth noting. Traditionally, the monuments on the mall are classical, static monuments for the commemoration of heroes or victories. With their grand vertical structure, think of the Washington Monument as the prime example of this, they require a distance to see them. And what those monuments offer is a confrontation with a higher purpose, idea, or value that they represent. In recent decades, then, there has been a shift towards so-called counter-memorials, often as expressions of loss and grief. Those new types of memorials work predominantly with the horizontal axis, and they display multisensory features, inviting a person into engagement. They thus open up opportunity to holistically experience something from the past in a subjective and bodily way, allowing for a and reconstruction of memory that changes one's prospect of the future. The first notable of those new, non, or counter memorials is the Vietnam War Memorial, which was built in 1982, which visitors have indeed experienced as a place for healing. This form of remembrance as a multisensory experience is what can be seen in the practices of faith communities. Understanding religious remembrance may therefore be relevant to the flourishing of a society that adopts those ways of remembering. I therefore wonder if practices of memory may be considered a public health issue. Second, how does the link to religion fit in with the people of DC? Numbers from the 2023-24 Religious Landscape Study conducted by the Pew Research Center says that 56% of adults in the Washington, D.C. metro area identify as Christian, and a total of 11% adhere to other religions. This affiliation is not merely nominal, though. 64% say that religion is either very or somewhat important. 27% attend religious services at least weekly, and 25% between a couple of times a month to a few times a year. In terms of private religiosity, 45% pray at least daily and 20% pray weekly or monthly. While these numbers are likely to relate mostly to the majority Christian population, most adults of the Jewish population in DC celebrate Passover, the key Jewish festival of remembrance, as well as lighting Hanukkah candles, another commemorative celebration. Another aspect that is connected to the religious demographics of Washington, D.C. is the role of houses of worship that function as spaces of remembrance. While DC's general population has grown by around 18%, and the number of religious congregations almost doubled since 2000, the district lost 33% of its houses of worship over the same period. We know that sacred spaces and their function as third spaces are contexts that foster health and well-being, and they are significant for the building of memory because they are the places where religious rituals are commonly performed. This leads me to the third question: why study specifically worship for practices of memory? This links to the origin of rituals and the role that they play in building memory. They are worth studying in the context of memory because I'm quoting Eleanor Chadwick. Ritual is at once emotional and practical, celebratory and educational, larger than and intrinsic to a society. Ritual utilizes emotion and the sense of the sacred for the healing, teaching, and growth of a community. End of quote. As a medium that requires and elicits emotional engagement, it is therefore effective in building memory because we best remember things with which we have an emotional and personal connection. Further, ritual combines the imagistic with the doctrinal, the sensory with the semantic, and the emotive with the cognitive. They are thus able to communicate the content of memory in a way that is memorable. Which leads me to the fourth question: why study memory in the context of Jewish and Christian tradition? The short answer is that the Jewish and Christian faith have elaborate rituals and a narrative of hope and redemption that rests on remembrance. Since I want to turn to the empirical part of this study shortly, I just want to repeat the examples that I mentioned at the beginning. To remember the history of the people of Israel is foundational in Judaism, and to remember the life, death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus Christ is what the Christian faith is built on. In terms of theoretical frameworks, I approach the study of practices of memory mindful of what they are, namely actions that speak to the senses and engage the intellect. Bodies therefore matter, and my own body matters, as I collect data about these tangible experiences. For this study, it meant that between November last year and May this year, I spent almost every Shabbat in the Jewish Orthodox synagogue and Sundays and other holidays in the Eastern Orthodox Church. In the Jewish calendar, this was from Yom Kippur to Passover, and in the church calendar, it was Advent to Ascension. In addition to my observation and participation in those two contexts and many conversations during coffee hours and dinner tables, I conducted a total of 16 narrative interviews with individuals to hear their stories with and perspectives on their faith practices in relation to memory, hope, and health. This resonates for me with the approach of narrative medicine and the underlying philosophical frameworks of Levinas, Heidegger, and others. I will turn to the findings from those interviews on the next slide. But before that, I want to mention that the data from the study will not only be presented in form of a traditional academic article or presentations similar to this one, but I'm also working with an artist here in Washington, D.C., who's going to create a mural, which is an art form that has a well-established tradition here in D.C. That way, people can not only read and intellectually engage with the ideas, but hopefully have an embodied and transformative experience themselves with what this study is about. This is an overview of how I conceptualize the data that I collected. While the layout here may suggest that it is a linear process, it would be more accurately illustrated with a spiral in which this process is continually repeated, with each result at the end becoming another starting point. Further, individuals may make sense of this process in retrospect, thus reversing the sequence. So first, there is the story of redemption and hope. Religious stories are an interweaving of history and theology. History gives attention to the lives of those who have gone before, which lends names a particular role, as well as significant events, which confers meaning to certain places. Story thus answers the who, what, where, and when of the past of a faith community. Based on those historical places, people, and events, theology then is an interpretation of history through the lens of faith, making the past relevant for the present and the future. The story of a particular people and past happenings is thus not told as they, that, there, and then, but we, this, here, and now. Second, the story of the faith community then finds its embodiment in communal multisensory practices. So we're moving on to the next column. As Isabel, who took part in this study, says, quote, it's almost hard to separate broadly Jewish practice from history. And later she adds, in terms of like our daily practices, everything is just deeply connected. And if you're actively Jewish, if you actively understand all of Jewish history in every moment of the day. Sorry, if you're actively Jewish, you actively understand all of Jewish history in every moment of the day. End of quote. Using Bergson's terminology, I consider this story as image or representational memory that recollects the past, and the practices as habit or body memory that relives the past and the present. Third, the practices as vehicles of the story create peoplehood and subsequently form an individual's identity that is embedded in the community and story. John Swinton put it this way for the Christian context, quote, "It is as the church, as a living body of remembering friends, learns what it means to hold onto and practice the right memories, that healing, hope, and active remembrance become a practical possibility." And he continues, this is an abbreviated quote, "Worship recognizes the memory of God's great works, and within the worshiping community, our identity is sustained and upheld." End of quote. To give an example of this arc from story to practice to peoplehood to personhood, I want to quote from the interview with Isabel again, a Jewish woman and mom of 4, whose daughter's bat mitzvah I got to attend, and which took place a couple of weeks after our interview. So she took it as an example, saying, she, that is her daughter, is chanting from the Torah using an ancient cantillation and trope that has been passed down. And she's reading these words of ancient scripture that is telling the story of, her particular portion is this ancient story. And I'm going to be up there, that is at the lectern, and we're going to be singing a song welcoming her into adulthood and the Jewish people. And like all I can think about is like my grandparents and my great-grandparents and the people that I didn't even know. End of quote. In the following data presentation, I will be focusing on the practices of memory and the formation of individual identity with examples from the interviews. Here you can see another way of depicting the link between practices, peoplehood, and personhood. Each black circle represents one characteristic of practices of memory, while the outer golden circle stands for the community and the inner golden circle for the individual. This is what Chloe, a young Eastern Orthodox Christian woman, says about the practices of memory. Having those actions can really help create that more tangible connection to faith. When we talk about how those practices contribute to her flourishing and what makes her hold on to them, she says, "I think it kind of forms your identity in ways you don't know until later. Like, those were all established in my soul or my mind, my being from a kid." I will now turn to each of these characteristics of practices and how they form individual identity. Customs are the category for the marking of holidays, liturgy, songs, prayers, etc. They all provide structure to someone's life. I follow certain rituals, ranging from a daily pattern to a weekly pattern and to a monthly pattern and to an annual pattern of holidays. The memory is just trying to have that kind of prayer rule, just having that sense of schedule. I just feel like it just sets my day up to be a good day. And you're doing the prostrations, getting on your face and knees before God and just praying to have that remembrance that it's not about you. There's more to life than just you. I think that's very important. So if hope is this promise of life and death, then I would say that coming into contact with that's reality, that's the story of Christ. And anything that I do that reminds me of the reality of that pattern And that is in the books that we read, in the church fathers, in the liturgy, in the hymns, in the prayers, and not just explicitly in them, but also in the patterns by which those things manifest. The practice of Shabbat and every holiday, they're just thousands and millions of things that my life is constructed in a Jewish way. So I try to punctuate different parts of my day with prayers or with a reading, just to give me a little ritual reminder of what it means to be an Orthodox Christian. The link to tradition, that uncompromising sense of structure in a rapidly changing world, it's never changing. It's never going to compromise to whatever is going on, whatever is in vogue. And so I live liturgy to liturgy most of the time. Candles represent multisensory elements of practices of memory, and I'm presenting here the ones that relate to light. On the anniversary of their death, they get their candle lit up. One way I connect to the past is kind of through artifacts. So I have my grandparents' menorah that I light every year. My father has the etrog, the citron that we use on Sukkot, that was given to him by his rabbi, which used to belong to another famous rabbi. You see all the icons and the light coming in from the windows, and you see the incense, the smoke of it coming up, and you're getting hit by this, the smell of it. So it's activating all of your senses, and it can be like an otherworldly experience. When we light candles on a Friday night, that's something that is like deeply historical, because that is a tradition that like Jewish women have done in their homes for, millennia. In any Orthodox service, you have a good amount of burning of incense, and the incense in any setting represents our prayers going up to heaven. Some of the traditions of even lighting candles around the anniversary of her birthday or of her passing. Cuisine stands for traditional recipes or symbolic foods. The Eucharist helps me remember death and resurrection and Christ's own story. Why are we eating matzah? It is because that was the bread of affliction that we had on our backs when we left as slaves from Egypt. We eat this food that's called charazet. It's like apples and honey and nuts and cinnamon. And it's supposed to represent the mortar that they spread to connect the bricks when they were building as slaves. Food is tying us into history. You can see here the we rather than they in the recalling of history or story. Easter or Pascha is like a big thing. And every year we would do these traditions with my family. We would make bread. We would make 80 to 100 loaves of bread every year. So it's a huge thing. At the Passover Seder, it's all about doing things that recall this history. From dipping to the salt water to each thing is a reminder. Everything tonight is filled with so many symbols. And I mean, really, symbol after symbol after symbol. Everything has meaning. Everything has a purpose. On Shabbat, the table itself is like the altar, and the bread is part of an offering. And it's all meant to have some symbolic association. Especially Christ's death, the memory of that, which is what we do every liturgy. At the Last Supper, he breaks the bread and pours the cup, and he says that you would remember me. And so we are remembering Christ's death constantly. But it's not just that he died, it was that he was resurrected, and that's what gives us hope for salvation and for eternity. The result of communal practices of memory is an embedding of personhood in peoplehood. That is an identity that is rooted in a story. Everything we do isn't so much a commemoration, it is being. Before, I saw myself as a machine, and through orthodoxy, I found out I was human. First of all, observance of Shabbat and the holidays. If you do that, you're already far along in terms of remembering your identity and your role as a Jewish person. Secondly, the rituals that we have for death. The Passover Seder night is a communal night of remembrance, and I think it is the definitional Jewish act of remembrance. We come together around the table because we like to eat, and collectively, through symbolic reenactment, remember where we came from and define ourselves as part of this continuum. Prayers, reading, little ritual reminders of what it means to be an Orthodox Christian. Your whole being, your physical and spiritual being, are fully incorporated into the liturgy. And that practice of doing that same thing over the course of your whole life creates a space within you which you can learn a lot about yourself and those around you and the church and Christ, and it builds up a space for you to learn how to practice remembrance. Like when you pray and look up to the iconography, Christ is right up there. It grounds you in a space, in a time, in a place. It physicalizes the act of prayer so that it's not just my head thinking the right thoughts, it's every part of me, the integration of my entire self. As a note on what I call here the formation of identity, this point, and particularly its wording, was brought up in the interviews and the many informal conversations without my prompting. While the impact on their physical, emotional, social, and spiritual well-being is certainly important, what is most relevant for individuals in the Jewish and Christian Orthodox tradition is how their personhood or identity is embedded in a tradition that provides community and meaning. I thus see less of a biopsychosocial-spiritual model of health at play here, and instead many overlaps with the concept of human flourishing. On this, Levi says, well, I guess knowing who I am. This is his response to my question on the impact of religious practices on health, well-being, or flourishing. The Jewish ritual create a whole multi-thousand-year history, and Jewish ritual, the fact that I am a direct descendant of Levi. So on that score, I know who I am. And then as an American, I know the achievements of the United States. So I have those two big streams of support for my identity. Chloe Hume, I already quoted earlier again, it kind of forms your identity in ways you don't know until later. Like, those were all established in my soul or my mind, my being from my kid. And Jacob says, I can't live without Torah. My whole life is built around this. I'd be a different person. My life would be completely different without the Jewish practices that I engage in. I find them enriching, empowering, meaningful. They give direction to your thinking. They give direction to how you spend your life. Before I offer some thoughts on application, I want to draw together and integrate the findings from empirical studies with those from literature analysis in theology. As I just presented, the present study highlights certain characteristics and functions of practices of memory as multisensory communal experiences that communicate a story, and they thus help the individual connect to and across place, time, and community. The key elements that have also previously been identified as inherent in rituals are the function of structuring time, both in time, that is kairos time. Those are living rituals with a specific individual creative interpretation. And across time, that is chronos time, those are transhistorical rituals with a universal structure and language. Elements that speak to the senses, so that external physical experience leads to and fuses with internal spiritual understanding. Thus, as Rabanus Maurus, a 9th century Benedictine monk, put it, the human body functions as a sketched blueprint for wide-ranging Christian exegesis, which I think may apply to any faith tradition. And finally, symbolism as the intertwining of the physical and metaphysical, so that material things point to an immaterial reality or story. In parallel, analysis of theological literature shows that hope, too, is embedded in time, physicality, and relationship. In time, in the sense that it connects the past, present, and future. Physicality, where it stems from the body and pain. First, the broken body of Christ, and then any hurting body of spiritual darkness, for it is there that hope comes most powerfully alive. And relationship, for hope may come from God or another human being. There's always a reciprocity in hope, just as there is in symbolism. This correspondence of the nature of memory and hope may thus explain why memory nourishes hope. And to show how hope then culminates in identity, I will quote from 2 interviews. First, from the conversation with Mia, who was part of the study on hope in the context of chronic pain. She says, quote, "With hope, I feel more at home in my body. Because because pain can make you feel like you've got this invader coming in and try and take over. But hope makes me feel like I'm one and one with my body." And again, Isabel, who was part of the present study, says, quote, "I feel deeply, deeply, deeply Jewish, and I'm deeply Jewish in my practice." End of quote. The reason for her strong emphasis here is in the context of her distinguishing liturgy and prayers, which are less important for her from other practices of memory. Since this is the Spirituality and Health Research Seminar, and many of you will be working in clinical or pastoral contexts, I want to offer some thoughts on application. So, if practices of memory create identity through providing structure, speaking to the senses, and symbolizing of something beyond, I wonder if the consequence should be that we ask patients questions that address these things. I'm thinking of questions along the lines of, what gives meaningful structure to your life? How do you experience tradition with your senses? Which symbols connect you to the people and wisdom of the past? To start a conversation about practices of memory. And which tradition are you rooted in? And who's your community? To understand the communal and identity and individual identity of the patient. And with this, I would like to thank you for your interest and attention, and I invite your comments and questions. Thank you.
Okay, so everyone, here's your opportunity to talk to Lena and share your wisdom and ask questions. And whoever has a comment or a question, please raise your hand. Raise your hand and unmute yourself. Here is a comment in the chat. Lena, do you have a slide showing some of your sources of quotes used today?
And my contact details on the last slide, which I understand will be on the website.
And Russell Barr says, awesome presentation. Thank you for sharing. And this has been an amazing presentation. We don't get many qualitative speakers, and I think on this topic, it's absolutely essential.
Thank you. Thank you.
Who's going to ask a question?
There are comments and questions in the chat. I see. Thank you, Chaplain Eric, Miguel Santa Maria. Yes, so on the question, how do practices of memory are similar or different with remembering, only words difference? I think what you will have seen in this presentation was both my wording or the wording that I took from the literature, and then also the wording from my research participants, where remembering and memory worked better than remembrance, which they associate mostly with remembering the dead. But I wanted to have a fuller picture on what are all the different events, places, storylines that are being remembered and upheld. And that's why there was this change in wording from rituals of remembrance to practices of memory.
And I see here a comment from Lennart. Did you get data from secular people?
So not for this study, but if I were to extend it, I'm definitely thinking about a comparison like I did for my doctoral studies, where I had people of faith and people of no faith on speaking to the topic of hope. And I may replicate the study in other faith traditions and then also in a secular context. But for this one, it was just Orthodox Judaism and Orthodox Christianity.
I see Rhonda Daniels has herself unmuted.
Yes, I have a question. Good to see you, as always. And I really enjoyed this presentation. I liked how you paired the two different faiths, the Christian faith with the Jewish faith. And I was wondering, when you talked about the memory of Jesus Christ by taking communion, which is what my faith does, in your study, how was that compared with the Jewish remembrance? What exactly in their faith would have been compared with that particular? Is it Passover?
It is Passover, but more so Shabbat, I think. So where you have both the elements of bread and wine. They obviously have very different theological meanings, and the Christian Eucharist is a reinterpretation of Passover. Yes, but I think in terms of their function, they're very similar, that they both recall the story.
Thank you.
Sandy, I see that you've made a comment here in the chat. Would you like to elaborate on that at all? Unmute yourself and elaborate. If not, that's okay.
Yes, absolutely. I think one of the things that's always so I grew up Anglican in the South African context, and I'm just kind of just thinking through this presentation and how I was growing up with stories. I was growing up in the church, but my father was told that he didn't belong in the church because he came from a Dutch Reform background. And I realize now how hard it then is as our family unit to, our identity was affected because he wasn't part of that story with us. And sometimes then my mother wasn't included in that too, because she was kind of torn between my dad and then us children. And so I'm so grateful to Lena for this work that she's doing, because it's helping me just form some ideas of what might have been going on for me as a child, and how that way there's parts of something that is so important that you miss out on if your whole family unit isn't made to feel welcome in a faith community.
Yeah. Well, thank you for elaborating, Sandy. It makes a lot of sense. Lena, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, what's what some people talked about was their relationship between being embedded in their faith community and then in their secular lives, and how sometimes in one case, one woman withdrew from her Christian Orthodox practices for a while and joined the Episcopal Church because she didn't feel safe in the secular environment to associate with Eastern European roots for a while. So yeah, that was just a fascinating and very sad story too, on the clash of identities and how we need the context, and it can't just be us building our own identity, but it is always in response to and separation from those around us, both in the secular environment and then also in the different church contexts, or the Jewish communities, and how it needs the community, how you cannot just be a person of faith by yourself, but that it needs this close-knit community of believers.
Good. Very good. So, Leonard, do you have any thoughts you'd like to contribute to our discussion? Leonard from South Africa?
Many South Africans here.
Yes. Oh, maybe Leonard came off of the call. Any other comments anyone would like to make or share? Did we cover how do practices of memory are similar or different with remembering?
Mm-hmm.
We already covered that one. Okay, very good. Okay, this is from Matthias from Argentina. Thank you so much for sharing this space of integration so generously in our country. We have many memory practices surrounding the Jewish community and the attacks they suffered years ago. The question is, in your research experience, do you think memory practices contribute to the processing or elaboration of traumas associated with the community?
Yes. One specific example I have on this is last October, for the 1-year anniversary of October 7th, there was I forget what they called it now. There was an event on remembering the events, and that's even in the title of the event, which was an evening of storytelling and remembrance, it had the word hope, and several of the speakers would say that they do have hope, that they are hurting, and that the trauma is still there and it will take a long time to heal, if ever, but they have hope because they're in it together and they're not on their own. And that togetherness and knowing that they're also not going to be alone in the future gives them hope. Yeah, so I found that a striking example of communal remembrance and building of hope.
And Marion has a comment. She says she works in the field of dementia care. I think your work is important to understanding person-centered care and identity. Marion, would you mind unmuting yourself and maybe elaborating a little bit on your comment?
Just that I think for many of us, faith and our practices are very important in our life. And when that's not there, there's that sense of loss of self. And I think understanding what you've been talking about, memory, rituals, and how they're different for different people, and that contributes to a sense of identity. What I've seen in care communities is they may have just a worship service and expect or assume that everybody's going to participate or find that meaningful, and that I don't think is the case. And not that you can have too many varied kinds of worship services and whatnot, but I think it's important to recognize what's important to individuals, if that makes sense. I know for me, if I happen to get dementia and be in a care community, I, gosh, would want to go to church. I would want to engage with people of faith that I connect with. That would be so important to me, and a loss if I couldn't. And my original question about people who aren't engaging in practices and faith, I'm afraid that they may not even recognize that as something of importance for other people. If that makes sense.
A lot of sense.
Yes,
Good.
yes. And I think where in recent years and decades we have seen this almost experiment on the younger generation that we say you can build your own identity independent from anyone, and we've seen how that is not helpful and even detrimental to their health and well-being and flourishing on various levels. And yeah, so I hope that this contributes to an awareness that for many of us, we are rooted in traditions and practices of memory, and they build our identities. What many, if not all of my participants talked about was the link between it needs the practice with all the different characteristics that I spoke about, but they need to convey a story, so they need to have content, and you need to explain to your children, if you want to have them make them meaningful to them, what they are about. But at the same time, you can't just with words tell them the story, but they need to have a tangible element so that they become meaningful.
Good. Patrick, you're up. Patrick Kelly.
Hey, how are you? Thank you so much for the this overview and synthesis. I'm wondering, you've studied in Leipzig, you've studied at the University of Durham, you've been in a European context, you've been in an American context, but mainly Western. And then you sort of mentioned the younger generations. And there's been some research, I mean, this is probably 10 years ago, that showed that like 50% or more of Eastern Orthodox seminarians are converts from Protestantism. And so I wonder kind of what's been the response to your work from like the more Western Protestant, I guess people of sort of the Western Protestant kind of more reductionistic pathways. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I think this is,
Like as in people are looking for embodied experience more than just kind of a gnostic mind,
mhm.
and so people are reaching out to Orthodoxy and Greek Orthodoxy and Russian Orthodoxy, but they have this integration of the physical into the spiritual and the mental,
Yeah,
I guess.
yeah, yeah. Um, and and that's where it's interesting to kind of touch on the Jewish Orthodox community and East Christian Orthodoxy are both somewhat Eastern traditions, right? But I'm obviously in a Western context, so you have a little bit of an overlap there. And Christian Orthodoxy is the fastest growing Christian denomination in North America, and it is predominantly men in their 20s and 30s who are joining. Um, so yes, as you said, there is this desire for, oh, I'm more than my body and my brain, and I need to connect to the spiritual and I need to have a bodily experience of things. Um, so for those who are aware of that need and that longing, I guess it will resonate with. I don't know how this research will be perceived in the broader context where people just adhere to materialism. Yeah. I don't know.
Thank you.
Very good. Kenneth, you're up. We can't hear you. We're having trouble hearing you. And now it looks like you might be frozen. Maybe you could make your comment in the chat. That might work. And then Lena could respond to it. But right now we cannot hear you. Okay, Kenneth, I'll tell you what we'll do. I'm going to ask a question and then you see if you can get the technology to work there. So, Lena, how would this apply to the Far Eastern traditions, such as Buddhism, Hinduism, and Confucianism, those
Mhm.
Eastern faith traditions? Any thoughts about that?
Mhm. Um, I will say I know very little about the theologies of those traditions, and that's why I didn't include them. I could have included the Muslim tradition, certainly in DC, but I'm conscious of my own lack of knowledge in that regard. And for me, it is important to think about concepts, and that very much influences how I ask my questions in the interviews. So it would be me conducting research in a Jewish or Christian concept would be very different to any other traditions that I'm less familiar with. So I don't know if I'm the right researcher for those studies. And the my my assumption, having seen similarities between people of Christian faith, Jewish faith, or no faith in particular, and seeing the similarities there, at least in the Western world, I wonder if there is something universal in faith traditions around the world that speak to something that is part of our human nature.
Yes, I would agree with you, Lena, on that. Very much so. Seem to be just part of our human nature gets expressed in different ways in different cultures and different faith traditions. And those religions almost always have rituals of various kinds, and they have holy scriptures, they have traditions, and so I think there probably are quite a number of parallels with what you've talked about today. Any other questions here? We have 5 minutes, and if there are no other questions, we will conclude for today, but any comments or observations? I think we've covered pretty much what's been expressed in the chat. Here's a new message. Paul Houston, okay, this has been a very enlightening, hope-generating presentation. Thank you for your work. So,
I'm very glad. Thank you.
very good. And several other thanks. Okay, Russell, go ahead. Unmute yourself.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
All right, so I'm kind of coming from this with my secular hat on right now. I actually work for the Missouri Department of Transportation, and I came across this series based off Dr. Koenig's work for spiritual resiliency and moral injury in the military, and traumatic informed care, which for my organization alone, we lose about 1.4 workers a year to a traumatic incident on a job site. And so I just wanted to express some gratitude, I guess, and just tell you what an enlightening talk I thought this was. And I'm not sure exactly how it's going to plug into it yet, but I feel like there's some good things here to apply to our cultural development as far as it goes for safety. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Very good, Russell. And these slides, as well as the video, will be up on our website. Probably later this afternoon, so you can review it. And I'm sure Lena would be happy to answer any questions. By email.
Can I say something? Sorry, I don't know how to put my hand up.
Sure, Joan, go ahead.
I really enjoyed this as well, and I'm not sure exactly how it relates, similar to what Russell just said, except that what kept going through my mind is the fact that the identity of a parish, a smaller group, and what that means. And so what I'm thinking is that we are in a situation in Baltimore where a lot of our parishes are being dissolved, and we're supposed to form with another group. And we're very different in identity. I know that. So somehow I think that this is important in terms of, and it may relate to the trauma that you were talking about or the grief as well, but somehow I think it's relevant, and I have to sort of make sense out of that. But I appreciated really hearing about your work. It's really good. Thanks.
Thank you, Joan. Any other questions here before we, now there is a comment by Kenneth. Here we go. I've enjoyed the whole line of discussion. The woman who was speaking about memory with dementia made me think of when I would lead services once a month at our elder house in Alaska, where by spending time with the residents on a regular basis throughout the weeks and honoring their memories. So, excellent, excellent. Okay, any last question before we conclude for today? Raise your hand if you have any, otherwise, I'll give you 10 seconds before we conclude. Well, first of all, while the 10 seconds are elapsing here, thank you, Lena, for a wonderful presentation. I really loved what you presented, especially from the two different faith perspectives, and many of the questions that the participants today raised, were very helpful in fleshing out a lot of the things that you talked about today, Lena. So thank you so much for taking your time, and for everyone taking their time.
Thank you. Thank you all.
So everyone, goodbye. See you next month.
Bye. Thank you.